This is the story of a man who was born in the small town of Cobalt, Ontario, and was the fourth of 9 children. His mother Yvonne was a homemaker, and his father Wilfred was an alcoholic and worked as a presser in a dry cleaning business. At the age of 8, his parents sent him to a Christian training school for orphans and truants. It was at this school where he was sexually abused and bullied. Growing up, he became a shiftless drifter, consorted with other criminals, and committed petty crimes in order to survive. As a result, he compiled a criminal record that included conviction for living off the avails of prostitution, theft, and assault. This man became the longest-serving innocent Canadian to have a murder conviction overturned. This is the story of Romeo Phillion. On August 9, 1967, an Ottawa firefighter named Leopold Roy was stabbed to death in an apartment building where he was superintendent. With the help of a description supplied by Roy's wife, Mildred, police assembled a composite sketch of the killer. Days later, Phillion's prostitute girlfriend, Gail Brazeau, told police that he resembled the composite sketch. After seeing him in a police lineup, Mildred Roy stated that Phillion resembled the man who stabbed her husband. It is important to note that Mildred identified several other men as suspects, but they were all dismissed, and Phillion had an alibi and was several hours away from Ottawa during the time of the murder. They released Phillion on the grounds that the lineup evidence from Mildred Roy was insufficient to sustain a criminal charge, and Gail Brazeau was found to be untrustworthy. On January 11, 1972, Phillion was picked up for questioning in connection with an armed robbery of a taxi driver. His 18-year-old boyfriend at the time, Neil Miller, was also brought in for questioning. It is important to acknowledge that Phillion was bisexual, and during the 60s and 70s, this was highly stigmatized, and as such, he was further marginalized within society. When Phillion was questioned, he admitted to the Roy murder and agreed to supply a full confession if he were permitted to see Neil. Hours later, he recanted his confession, but it was too late. This confession would later play a huge role in his trial and in his eventual conviction. But why would Phillion do this? Was it to protect his boyfriend Neil because he believed that Neil would not survive if he went to jail? Why did the criminal justice system not examine his vulnerability and mental health after he confessed? People with a mental illness are more likely to make false confessions because they are vulnerable and misunderstand the context of their confessions. Did he confess because he knew that it would end the interrogation and anticipated that the benefit or the reward would outweigh the risk of his tragic consequences? These questions will serve as a guide when using a critical lens to analyze his wrongful conviction. His trial began on October 16, 1972. The Crown built its case on 3 key pieces of evidence: Mildred's identification of Phillion as the man who had killed her husband, Phillion's confession to the crime, which he had given freely, and his confession to Neil. Phillion's defense lawyer, Arthur Cogan, attempted to cast doubt on his mental health. He painted Phillion as someone who would say anything to make himself sound important, including confess to a murder. Further evidence from 2 psychological experts stated that Phillion suffered from antisocial personality disorder, and that he had a propensity to lie and invent stories to make himself feel important, which may have played a role when he falsely confessed. Furthermore, Arthur Cogan pointed out that the police had lost many pieces of evidence that should have been presented in the case, including a hair sample taken from Phillion and fingernail scraping, blood, and hair samples taken from Roy. Defense contended that Phillion and Miller concocted a plan in which Phillion would confess to the Roy murder in hopes of obtaining reward money. According to the plan, Miller was to corroborate the confession. Unfortunately, despite the lack of evidence presented, Phillion was found guilty on November 7, 1972, and was sentenced to life in prison with no parole eligibility for 10 years. There is a question to be asked here. Why would the jury find Phillion guilty without realizing the significant lack of police evidence? Is there an institutional issue at play here? Phillion attempted to appeal his conviction to the Ontario Court of Appeal, arguing that due to the many problems inherent in the police investigation, he had been deprived of the presumption of innocence to which all accused persons are entitled. He was unsuccessful, and the court dismissed his appeal on September 3, 1974. He didn't give up. Phillion sought leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. On March 22, 1977, this appeal was dismissed. Phillion began writing letters to the Minister of Justice, stating that he had been out of town at the time of Roy's murder and asked that his case be reopened, but no action was taken. Despite the rejections, Phillion maintained his innocence until the end. In Canada, the wrongfully convicted who assert their innocence are denied parole or temporary absences, even if there is evidence that would normally favor a positive outcome. This is called Catch-22, the innocent prisoner's dilemma. If a prisoner maintains their innocence, the likelihood of being released is greatly diminished. As a result, Phillion encountered secondary victimization where he maintained his innocence, but the corrections system further violated his rights by not believing in him. Remorse, which is a willingness to acknowledge guilt, is essential for parole, and Phillion was not going to show it. Due to Phillion's refusal to seek parole and accept responsibility for a crime that he didn't commit, he is the longest-serving innocent Canadian to have a murder conviction overturned. More than 20 years later, in 1998, Romeo's parole officer gave him an envelope containing police reports from his Corrections Canada file. One of these documents was a police investigation report that had been prepared on April 12, 1968, by the investigating officer, Detective McCombie. This report was important because it provided Romeo with an alibi. It indicated that Romeo was hours away from Ottawa in Trenton between noon and 1 p.m. on August 9, the day of the murder, therefore making it impossible for him to be the killer. This report was never presented at his trial. After receiving that report, he sent it to the Innocence Project at Osgoode Hall Law School. On May 15, 2003, the Innocence Project and Innocence Canada, formerly AIDWIC, submitted a Section 696.1 application for ministerial review to determine if his conviction was a miscarriage of justice. While the Minister of Justice considered the application, Romeo was awarded bail, bringing an end to his 31 years spent in prison. Romeo continued to assert his innocence. On August 2, 2006, the Minister of Justice ordered that the Ontario Court of Appeal reopen Romeo's case. The court concluded that the Crown had not intentionally pursued their case against him, knowing that he was innocent. There was also confusion surrounding whether and when the police learned further information that discredited his alibi. Detective McCombie testified that after submitting the April 12, 1968 report, he retrieved toll records of Romeo's car showing that he could have made it back in time to kill Roy in Ottawa, but there was no evidence to confirm that the detective made this trip. Justice Moldaver found the complete lack of documentation disturbing. Regardless of what exactly happened due to police misconduct, it was clear that the Crown prosecutor had a copy of the April 1968 report, which was never disclosed to Arthur Cogan. If Cogan had the report, the trial would have likely been different and Phillion probably wouldn't have spent 3 decades in prison. The Court of Appeal overturned Phillion's conviction and ordered a new trial. The Crown withdrew the murder charge against him on April 29, 2010, on his 71st birthday, since there was no reasonable chance that the new trial would result in his conviction. Phillion falsely confessed to a murder. Dr. Gudjonsen, an expert on the psychology of false confessions, explained that voluntary false confessions are common in high-profile cases and can be motivated by many factors, including a desire for notoriety, an unconscious need to expiate guilt over unrelated transgressions, an inability to distinguish fact from fantasy, a desire to aid and protect someone else, and revenge, either on someone who the confessor also implicates or on the police whose time is wasted by the false confession. Recall that during Romeo's recantation, he stated that he wanted to get even with the police, so him and Neil came up with a plan to send the police on a wild goose chase, which would enable them to collect the reward money from Neil's report of his false confession. Furthermore, Dr. Gudjonsen stated that Romeo suffered from antisocial personality disorder and personality disorder, and as a result, these two conditions might have led to his false confession. Perhaps increased knowledge regarding these conditions and access to mental health services for Romeo prior to his false confession might have prevented this tragedy. Unfortunately, our society still struggles to appropriately address the needs of Canadians who suffer from mental illness both within and outside of the justice system. It is important to note that Romeo was convicted in 1972 and the video that you are watching was created in 2021. Our society has come a long way with regards to the stigma associated with mental health, but it isn't enough. How can the criminal justice system do better to address the vulnerability of individuals who suffer from mental health disorders? How can they ensure a fair trial for all members of society? Mental health professionals should work together with the police to provide better education and training for identifying vulnerabilities within their suspects. Moreover, it's also important to note that Phillion was bisexual and this was stigmatized in the 70s, which means that he was ostracized in society and this tainted his character. Our justice system is based on a mythical concept called the rule of law, which stipulates that everyone is equal before and under the law. So why did they specifically target Romeo, a marginalized individual within society? The jury put too much emphasis on Mrs. Roy's eyewitness testimony. Many people believe that eyewitness testimonies are credible, but witnesses make confident and incorrect eyewitness identifications at a high rate. And these problems grow worse as the time interval increases between the time of the crime and the trial. To give an example, the U.S. Innocence Project estimates that eyewitness error was a contributing factor to 70% of the 356 wrongfully convicted accused that have been exonerated in that country. Using McFarland's typology, the police engaged in noble cause corruption when they lost evidence such as hair samples, scrapings, and blood, and failed to keep records of their investigations. These failures intersected with the Crown's failure to disclose the crucial April 1968 report containing Romeo's alibi to his lawyer. It's important to acknowledge that prior to 1991, Crown disclosure was made on a voluntary basis. Today, we have the Stinchcombe rule, which requires Crown prosecutors to disclose every relevant document to the defense, including information that the Crown does not plan to use in court but that could be important to the defense. Romeo was also an unpopular defendant as he was on the fringe of society, had a previous criminal record, and was supposedly mentally ill. As such, his lifestyle deviated from the norm. His marginalization played a role in his wrongful conviction and in his success in seeking exoneration and compensation. The jury convicted him, although there was reasonable doubt and lack of physical evidence linking him to the murder. Due to the stigma behind mental health, sexuality, and his desire to protect Neil, the jury at the time did not understand his reasoning behind his false confession. The prosecuting counsel is entitled to press fully and firmly every legitimate argument tending to establish guilt. They must be accurate, fair, and dispassionate in the conduct of the case. The culture of the Crown places more value on winning and resists the prospect of factual evidence. This is why the 1968 report was not disclosed. Historical concentration of attitudes, practices, and beliefs that give rise to tunnel vision further contributes to wrongful convictions and their perpetuation. This is an institutional problem because it creates a system that values speed over accuracy. Once you have a suspect, this contributes to tunnel vision and the police look for the fastest way to close the case. This was a high-profile murder case which caught the attention of the media and the public. Romeo freely confessed to the crime and he had an existing criminal record and a troubled past, exacerbating the tunnel vision by the police to focus on him as a prime suspect. As a result of the public pressure to convict and police tunnel vision, Phillion was convicted. It's also interesting to consider that there was no physical evidence that linked Phillion to the crime. It was the confession he made during the police interrogation when he was arrested for holding a cab driver at gunpoint that led to his wrongful conviction. In May 2013, Romeo was denied the right to sue for compensation by Superior Court Justice Eva Frank, but that decision was overturned on appeal and the Supreme Court gave him the right to proceed with a civil case. Unfortunately, Romeo passed away on November 2, 2015 without receiving any compensation for the time he spent behind bars. His life was robbed by the failure to acknowledge that confessions can be false, evidence can be withheld, and the criminal justice system can completely fail a Canadian whose innocence is superseded by the culture of the Crown and the public pressure to convict. Romeo supported others who were wrongly convicted, attended their court hearings, and encouraged and listened to them. He understood the trauma and pain of being wrongly convicted. Goffman's mortification process explains pain and grief associated with being inducted into an institution where an inmate's former identity is both literally and figuratively stripped away, and in turn, the inmate is forced to take on an identity provided by the institution. Furthermore, labeling theory explains how he was given a label provided by the criminal justice system, and they ended up treating him in a way that corresponds to that label. The various players in the criminal justice system are human, and therefore bring their own perspective, experience, aspirations, and fears to their decisions. I hope this video raises awareness about our troubled criminal justice system and acknowledgement that those who are convicted are human and are prone to mistakes. The laws are made by the ruling class to serve their own interests, while the marginalized suffer the consequences. Everyone deserves their voices to be heard and deserves a second chance.